Hello, my name is Rupa Marya. I am, I'm so grateful to be here in the land that colonized my ancestors' homelands, stole $45 trillion estimated of wealth and labor and resources from Punjab and India, what is now called India. This is a time of great healing and a time of great reckoning, a time of great reconnecting, and trying to understand how we collectively heal wounds that are too big for any of us to heal on our own, that can only be healed together. And I'm just sitting here like vibrating from the presence of these incredible women who are here. And we're going to have a conversation today about Indigenous wisdom, about women's wisdom, and about reconnecting and healing, and how we do it in this current context where the world is accelerating into very dangerous dynamics and places, where the rise of fascism and authoritarianism that has shown its ugly face time and time and again across our lands is threatening even more in this moment. And so to start this conversation, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm going to ask my sisters here to introduce themselves and to share whose wisdom you're carrying forward into this conversation, and also any relevant things you want everyone to know. I'll give an example, okay? So my name is Rupa. I was born and raised in occupied, unceded Ohlone territories of what's now called the San Francisco Bay Area. My ancestors are Punjabi. I come from a lineage of Sikh warriors who banged against the colonizers for several hundred years. I also come from a lineage of Hindu warriors from the deserts of Rajasthan. And I am here now as a pre-criminal in Trump's world for really wanting to call in a world beyond capitalism, a world beyond colonialism, a world where we are all earth people who learn how to share and respect and be in sacred relationship to one another and to this amazing life force that we inhabit called the earth. So that has made me a pre-criminal. I was fired from my 23-year professorship as a physician and professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, for saying stop bombing hospitals and for taking a stand against Gaza's genocide. I notice I'm one of only 2 kafiyas here today, and tomorrow, if I don't see more kafiyas, I'm going to stage a protest at the conference, because in the UK, where I'm actually providing medical support to the hunger strikers right now, some of whom are on beyond 60 days of a hunger strike, for their principled stance against the violence of what's happening, the genocide in Gaza. In a place like the UK, which is actively committing genocide, we need visible representation, we need visible signs, and we need our voices to be loud and clear that we do not tolerate this, not in our ancestors' past, not in the future, and not now. So that is me, and that is who will be chairing this conversation. So I'm going to hand it... I'm going to start with one of my favorite humans on planet Earth. When I'm feeling sad and scared, when I need to cry, this is who I call. So, Lyla Ju.
Okay. So I introduced my clans earlier, but I'm Nanisht Ejitrachitni, which means the black charcoal streak division of the Red Running Into Water people of the Dene Nation, also incorrectly known as Navajo, and that's my mother line. My second line that I honor is my father's mother, which is Tsitsesis Southern Cheyenne Nation. And the third line I honor is my mother's father's line, which is the Salt clan of the Dene. And then the fourth line I honor is my Scottish line, my father's father's side. And that's sort of how Dene people introduce their 4 clans before they speak. We are, on my mother's side, the Dene side, we are indigenous to what is now called New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah. but we call it Denebakea, Denetra, which means the people's land. And so we are desert people. We're also shepherds. We've been shepherds for thousands of years, hence all the wool and the weaving. And we are connected to the corn and the beans and the amaranth and the squashes. And this necklace is called a squash blossom necklace. So we're honoring all the foods and all the relatives that help us be here. And I guess some of the messages I'm carrying, I'm really into unity, and I'm really into forgiveness, and I'm really into love and compassion as a force. And I'm really into reminding everyone of their own indigenous roots, no matter who we are. And anyways, I could go on, but I'll leave it there for now.
All right. Hi, my dear.
So, Pnaunda, it's really lovely to be here with you all. My name is Angharad Wynne. I am a daughter of the Demetai of what you know today as Southwest Wales, one of the tribes of old Britain, or as we might have known it back then, Clas Merddin. I did, one of those funny DNA things. My husband bought it for me a couple of years ago, and he has a really rich and interesting DNA, and I came out as 99% Welsh and 1% Irish. So most of my ancestors have been born and farmed in the area of the Towy River, and I've kind of returned to that area now, although I live close to the Cothi. And we don't speak of our Celtic tribal ancestors as much as we should, because it's so difficult to trace our ancestry back to there. But more typically, we don't even think of ourselves often as indigenous, even though technically we are. But it's such a difficult politically word for us to take on board, because we've been kind of co-opted into forces that have, brutalized other parts of the world. Welsh, Scottish, Irish, all of us. We tend to use our own old word, which is brodorol. We think of ourselves as people of our locality. And for us, knowing the stories, the history, the rocks, the rivers, the stories that are in the landscape, and having a culture of the art of belonging is something that is still very strong. And our language is a part of that. So I think of myself as somebody who is brodorol. Part of my locality, the rocks and the rivers, they're in my blood, they're part of who I am. But also an intrinsic part of that habitat. We don't use that word habitat, we use the word Cynefin, which is much more about hearth and home and all the beings on that land and the webbing of all of that. So we understand ourselves as an important mixture in that, and we're just starting to reclaim, in my generation, there's a number of us starting to reclaim some of our older traditions and exploring how they support us in this time, this momentous time that we're walking through. So I think that's how I'm turning up today.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, our sister who blew in from Aotearoa.
Ai, kia ora. Ko puke tāpapa te maunga, ko ōrua rangi te awa, ko te mānukanuka o hoturoa te moana. Ko hape te rangatira, ko kaiwhare te tupua, ko makairau te marae, ko tahi waru, wai o hua, ngā timahuta, a waikato tainui, ngā hapu, ngā iwi, a rā ko Pania Newton tōku ingoa. Before I mentioned my name, I recited my pepeha. In any formal Māori setting or back home, in my context, before you would even introduce your name, you would identify the geological features in your area that inform your identity, that inform your sense of place and belonging before you would even get to your name, because that is where you are in the ecosystem, or that's where we place ourselves in our ecosystem from our Māori perspective. So for us, the environment is our elders. The environment comes before us, and we are only part of it. And so in my culture, it's really important that we identify our mountains, our sacred mountain, our rivers, our oceans, our sacred voyaging vessels, our sacred community houses known as marae, and our tribes before we would even get to self. And I guess that gives you an idea or a perspective of how I view my world and how I connect to the environment. And in my culture, we have this term known as kaitiakitanga, which can loosely be translated to English to mean stewardship. And you cannot say that you practice kaitiakitanga or stewardship or be a kaitiaki or a guardian of a particular environment unless you walk that environment, you smell, you touch, you interact, or you have a relationship with that environment almost every single day. And so I'm a kaitiaki of the environment in which I connect most to, which I term our tūranga waiwai, the place where I feel my greatest sense of place and belonging. And that is in a small village o Papakainga in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is known as Ihumātao. It is only 5 minutes from the Auckland International Airport, and although thousands of people fly over it every day or drive past it, little people know about its significance. Ihumātao is known as the oldest continuously occupied Māori village in Auckland, and arguably one of the oldest villages in Aotearoa. It is where archaeologists describe where Polynesians became Māori. Ihumātao and my people are known as gardeners. We've grown gardens and food to sustain our people from time immemorial. And in 1863, our people were evicted from our lands for a rebellion that never actually took place or can never be evidenced. And since then, until 2016, our people were disconnected from these lands. In 2015, me and my cousins started a campaign known as the Protect Ihumātao campaign, and we stood for three things. Stop a transnational corporation from developing 480 homes on this sacred land, which is 38 hectares of land, uphold the mana or the authority of our people, and to protect the land for future generations. We moved onto the land in 2016, where we say we reclaim the land because it was stolen from us, but others might say we occupied it. In 2019, 120 police officers and Fletcher building staff and contractors came to evict me and my family from the land. We put a mass call out on social media on a Tuesday morning, and by that Friday afternoon, 11,000 people had passed through Ihumātao to stand in solidarity with our cause. That was enough public interest to prompt the Prime Minister to put a halt to the development and put the land in a trust, a holding trust, which has been in this trust for the last 5 years. Since that time, my family have had 52 gatherings over Zoom during COVID on our marae, which is our sacred meeting grounds, and various other places where we've come together to develop a vision or a master plan for what we would like to see on this 38 hectares for the next 200 years. And it's my responsibility to ensure that we are progressing in the time that I am here on this earth to pursue that 200-year master plan for the future generations in mind. So every day that we're on that land, we are planting and harvesting food. We are reclaiming the forests that were felled through colonization and the farming that took place on that land. And we are reconnecting with it and reclaiming our ways of being and doing on that land which were lost through colonization. And so that's what I bring, that's what I offer or can contribute to this beautiful conference in the days to come. So I'm really honored to be invited to come and participate and to sit on this magnificent panel with these amazing women. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'm so grateful that you bring to this discussion the struggle, because we're going to talk a little bit about struggle. Because reclamation, sometimes when we use these words, like, oh, we're reclaiming our voices and reconnecting, that is not a dynamic that happens in a vacuum. It's happening against certain forces. There's a friction, and so that friction can create trauma. It can also create healing. And so I'm excited to talk more. But will you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, my name is Andrea Falcón. I come from Peru. And my background is Andean, some call us Quechua, because we speak Quechua. My father's side is from the region that used to be populated, but what we know as Chavin culture in Ancash. And on my mother's side is in Cusco, what we know was populated by the Inca civilization. And both my parents are products of forced displacement to the capital because of terrorism, narco traffic, and also military conflict in Peru. So when my parents were teenagers, when my dad was sent to Lima alone, faced discrimination, faced being forced to fit into academic and work system, same with my mother. So by the time I was born, when Peru was starting to heal from this political conflict and terrorism period, the norm for many kids in my generation was to be completely amputated of our identity and have this identity hidden from us. And we were the families that would try to send us to international schools. So I went to a British school, learned British culture, learned English. The more I grew up listening racist comments all the time, and my family pushing me to believing I was somewhat white because I was a bit pale. And I lived the problems of mental health that this caused within myself and other kids in my generation. I saw this in my family, this systemic violence inflicted inside the families, so we could continue hiding our nature, even though we didn't have these rituals in the mind, we have it encoded in our body. So animism was something that I was strongly connected as a child. And just for expressing that, I was medicated at an early age, sent to a psychiatrist. I was mistreated in school, and all of that led to teen pregnancy. And it was only then, by connecting with the healthcare system, having the private, whitewashed healthcare system of Peru failing to me, that we had to go look for alternative medical care, and this came from Indigenous practitioners, and that is how I started reconnecting with this other side and finding the answers of all of my pain and the emptiness that I felt inside. And by becoming a mother, having the responsibility to explain and translate this world that I was not capable to understand myself to my child. And since then, I started uncovering the past of my family. Turns out we were always fighting for what we considered was right, from my grandparents, my parents. Then I could start understanding my parents' work in the government, which also was kind of hidden from me. My mother was kidnapped 2 times when I was a child. I had been exposed to a bomb, and I was not told about it, but I remember it in my body. So narco-traffic and terrorism did shape my childhood enormously. And my path to become an activist into spiritual healing, plant medicine or plant-based, land-based healing, intercultural faith, and systemic change, all the way from agriculture to financial systems, now in Switzerland, was guided by this urge of reconnecting to identity as a way of reconnecting to life, to source.
Thank you. So this word, belonging, land, belonging, reclaiming, indigenous, these words, indigenous wisdom, to sort of unpack some of these, because the processes of colonial capitalism that we're living with and we're suffering under right now have led to a division. Divide and conquer was the MO. And the division is ourselves from one another, ourselves from our historical roots, ourselves from our ways of knowing who we are, ourselves in our landscapes, our mountains, our rivers, and our duties of care to one another, and also to the web of life to which we belong. And so in this day and age, when the word indigenous has been used to justify the slaughter of Gaza's children, oh, we're indigenous to the Levant, so we're just going to murder our way into taking land. The way indigenous reclamation in some parts of Europe are now being used to justify this is our land and you don't belong here, so ethno-nationalism. We're in this time when the real victims of colonialism, being the land, the web of life, and different peoples, victimhood's being sort of flipped around. There's some language play happening that's dangerous. And so I want to understand from these amazing people around me, your thoughts on what does indigenous mean? Is it an identity? Or is it a practice? Is it a way of knowing or being? What does that mean? And how do we do this work of reclaiming indigenous wisdom, bringing forward that wisdom without it getting co-opted or repackaged to enact genocide, exclusion, and harm to people who are going to be on the move? Billions of people on the move in the next 10, 15 years. So what can indigenous wisdom teach us? I know that's kind of a loaded question. But.
I think that indigeneity obviously can be defined in many different ways. And one of them is that you are of the land. But as you said, sometimes that fact of being of the land, or saying that you're of the land, can be weaponized. And I think that's where bubbles up another definition, which is that do we or do we not not only believe in, but embody the values of the ancestors. And this is made apparent in the food system as well. For example, I studied dozens of different indigenous food systems, and I was really focused on how big it was, how old it was, where it was, what types of materials were used to build the clam gardens, or what types of prescribed burning was used to maintain the chestnut groves, or what kind of harvest practices were used to sustain the oyster fisheries, the eel farms, what kind of support for the bison was employed, and looking at it from the mechanistic lens that I was trained to look at it through. And I studied it for many years, and when I finally realized I was studying the wrong thing, which is that it had very little to do with how the food system was maintained and all the clever ways that fish traps were made and ahupua'a watershed farming was practiced. It had very, very little to do with how it was done, and much, much more to do with why it was done. Because I realized if you handed this same clam garden in the Pacific Northwest that was over 3,000 years old, if you handed this same technology to a capitalist, would it have lasted that long? Same rocks, same coastline, same clams, same beautiful ocean. And I realized, no, it wouldn't have. Because it wasn't actually the rocks and the clams and the ocean necessarily, and the intertidal rock walls that they constructed 3,000 years ago to augment clam habitat. It wasn't really that which created a sustainable, nutritious, honorable, beautiful food system. What it was that sustained it was love and care and humility and respect for the land and for the clams themselves, and reciprocity and reverence and responsibility to life, and regenerative thinking that we have to always leave the place better than we found it. And not to say these ancestors were perfect. They also learned through war that war sucks. And they had to learn their own peacemaking strategies with each other. And so my point is that indigeneity, the way it looks outwardly, or the way it's defined attached to physical location, is actually inconsequential compared to the values that we live by. And since we're in a Christian church of a beautiful anti-capitalist Palestinian man named Jesus, yeah, I love Jesus. He was about welcoming the refugee. And he was about honoring women. And he was about loving each other. And that's what so many indigenous teachings talk about around the world, is to love each other and take care of each other. And I think that without that spirit of love, our indigeneity is irrelevant and useless without love for each other, for the land, for the refugee, for those who are struggling, for the women, and honoring the Creator. So, in other words, values which are invisible and intangible are much more consequential, ironically, and have more gravity, despite not having any material to them, than anything physical or terrestrial.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else want to have a reflection on that, those questions, or?
On what it is to be indigenous. I would agree a lot on what I just heard. I think that indeed the word indigenous, it depends on in which context we're talking about it. the biological context, the political one, the trendy one in wellness, and there's been a lot of like green or indigenous washing, as some of my activist friends call it. I have myself experienced a lot of like having to sort of explain why it's not like glorifying indigenous peoples or somebody that dresses indigenous is a way of exotism and a way of racism and a way of that really doesn't get us closer to these values that we just mentioned. Like indigenous people or people that still hold practices are not necessarily always good. There is indigenous communities doing practices as like genital mutilation and child marriage that I was recently in Africa speaking about how are so many still harmful practices still being performed by indigenous communities. So I'm very much, I would say, indigenous doesn't mean perfect or holy, but it does mean that you may have access to tools and to wisdom on how to use these tools that are incredibly useful and aligned to life for the rest of humanity. And those tools have been forgotten, and that wisdom has been forgotten. So, but the fact that as an indigenous person, some may sit whole as the keepers of these tools and these know-hows on how to use these tools, that doesn't mean that they will always have the discernment to apply them. So I think it depends on the context and the level of consciousness of the person, regardless of indigenous to where they are. And for that, I would also agree that everybody is indigenous to somewhere. We're indigenous to land and to life, and life and land are about love and creation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It makes me think of, so I'm here at this conference, this pre-conference, this event, because of Mankan Magan, who asked me to come here in April. And he would say the same thing, that we're all indigenous, and he would talk about Irish people as indigenous to Ireland. And then another friend of ours, Jimmy Billings, was arguing, actually, no, Irish people now are fully modern, that we've actually been deracinated or cut off from our roots of indigeneity. And then there's farmer Thomas O'Connor with Talibio, who I'm in conversation with down at the Kingdom of Kerry, who says, no, we're definitely indigenous, like we're here on this land, listening to this land. And so it's a very interesting question. And then Mankan came back like the week that he passed and said, actually, no, we're not indigenous. I changed my mind. So it's a very fraught question because, and I think it's actually something that we should think about because the rights of indigenous people to protect land and to protect the earth is something that we should lean into supporting at all, in any way. So this question of like us being indigenous, we're all indigenous to somewhere. I asked my friend Namonte Nenkemo, who is an Amazon protector of the Waorani tribe in Ecuador. She came to the farm in California, which I'm happy to say is in the hands of Ohlone people now. And she said, Rupa, I'm not going to work on saving the earth anymore because our children are being violated. Children around the world are being violated. And how can we even protect the earth when our own children are being harmed? And if we just focus on taking care of the children, actually the earth will be protected, which I found a very interesting way of thinking through things. And I asked her, well, Namonte, how do people who were indigenous, who are now modern humans, who are cut off from all of these forms of connecting and these ways of knowing, how do they reconnect? And she said something so interesting to me, and this is a question I want to ask each of you. How do we reconnect? She said to me, oh, it's easy. You just bring the children to the plants, and the plants talk to the children, and then you just follow what the children hear. And I looked at her, And my children are of this Punjabi, Desi ancestry, and on their dad's side have Irish ancestry. And when we moved to Ireland this summer, my oldest son refused to live in Dublin, and he says, can we just move down into the mountains? Like, I don't want to live here. I was like, oh God, okay, because I found a place they could walk to school. So okay, so let's go look. So we went down the mountains, and I found a spot that ends up being 10 minutes from where their ancestors are buried. And we had no idea. And so as they're encountering the forest now, they're recognizing the land, and actually the land is recognizing them. And they're having experiences that have blown my mind. And for me as a physician to hear my children coming in recounting these experiences, a part of my mind's going, oh, I could tell them they're just being fanciful, and no, they really didn't see that, and I could say that. Or I could do what Namonte told me to do, which was to follow the children. And so I did. And what's come out of that has been slightly mind-blowing for me as me. And so follow the children will lead us, the plants will instruct the children will tell us what to do. That is the opposite of how this colonial society operates, which is children should be seen and not heard. On the train ride here, I was told by a woman from the UK, dogs here are treated better than children. When we see the Epstein files, it's shocking. So how is it, what are practices, maybe you want to take this one on, how do we find our roots again when we have been disconnected as individuals and as communities? Especially those of us like me, I'm a refugee now of Trump's reality on my children's ancestors' homelands. How do we do that?
It's such a huge question. It's one of the biggest questions of our time. I'm working with refugees and asylum seekers at the moment, and I see it from that side, and I see the fundamental loss that happens when we as human beings are separated, when that separation happens from our natural way of being related to the land that we're on. In Welsh, we don't have a word for belonging other than hiraeth, which is the great longing ache. Belonging in Anglo-Saxons means actually a great ache, a great longing, rather than belonging. In Welsh, we call it perthyn, which is to be related to a place. And the language holds the framework of our own old ancestral ways of relating. So when human beings, whether they would count themselves indigenous or not, but if they have a relationship with the land that they're on, if they feel related to it, they know the stories of it, they love it, the severance of that is truly, truly, truly traumatic. And I think we're at a point where humanity's forgotten even that it's traumatic. It's so entraumatized within us generationally that we've almost forgotten. For me, I work a lot with this, and one of the most powerful things I think I've found is when we get human beings in a circle. I think the ancient technology of the circle is really powerful. Tentatively sharing, a little bit like we're doing here today, these tender and reclaiming the truth of our bond with land and how land seeps into us, and we offer ourselves into it, and we start to have those, what we might call spiritual relationships. We've lost the language, in the English language anyway. In Indigenous languages, there are more textures and nuance to the language. And when we don't have words even for the feelings that we're feeling, there is a disenfranchisement. There's a part of us that can't quite come home. So I think there's a lot of different work to do. There is, to go back to the childhood, I completely agree. Children come into the world with all the capacity to relate to wherever they land. But I think we have to remember that we have all been children, and we have that capacity to remember our way, to slough all it away. And from the work that we're doing in Wales, people like myself, one of the things that we're going back to, thank goodness for those generations before us that fought for Welsh language education. To be taught in your own language from the age of 3 and kind of to be able to grow in the language and be taught the stories of your Cynefin, your locality, and the history of it and everything like that, rather than the English language schools that generally have not been teaching that to the Welsh people. But to learn, to reconnect with the love of the story of place, to start to read that landscape as full of stories, because the stories hold the lore. And some of the stuff that is very clear to me, and I think it's probably universal to all Indigenous cultures, is that welcoming the stranger is incredibly important. And the laws of hearthside and hospitality are really, really important. And I listened to John Young here earlier on today talking about how his interaction with birds in his kind of homestead is enabling a shift in the patterns of how birds are territorial. And it only takes a few of us, and I count everybody in this room because I think we're all on a page here, standing in our truth about why we came here and these subtle feelings that we're feeling, and carrying it as a torch to fundamentally change things. And it only takes 3% to create a tipping point. So I'm really interested in those conversations that are rooted very often in this Indigenous law, this old law that has been honed by thousands upon thousands of years of our ancestors living in deep relationship, being guided by the land that we're on now. And I think that is something for me about what it is to be Indigenous in a land and a landscape, and what's called for. In my case, it's offering an access route to those stories and traditions and things that I grew up with, because I think they're really, the law contained within them is really important for this time now.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I wanted to know from you, also, if in addition to this question, a second question is, what role does struggle play in opening an avenue for people to reconnect?
So one of the things that I love about being part of this Indigenous global community one of the things that I see as part of our strength is that we have these rich stories of bravery, resilience, strength, and connection to the environment, us being of it and part of it. When I look at the social issues that our young people face in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a lot of the social issues around drug and alcohol abuse, mental health, poverty, crime, stem from colonisation, stem from being disconnected from their culture, their people, their ways of being and doing, and not having a connection to their culture and their lands, and not having a sense of place and belonging. And what I tell these young people when they come to the land, because at some point in their lives they seek out that connection. We know that when you have a strong sense of place and belonging, you are well. And so when they come to me, I say, we are so lucky to have these stories. And we share these stories with them about our ancestors, Hape being an underdog because he was left behind in Hawaii, one of our ancestral homelands, and he managed to arrive in Aotearoa before our great voyaging canoe tainui. We have a story of Hoturoa who overcame the great oceans of the Manukau, and because he overcome his anxieties, he was able to discover the rest of the Waikato tainui rohe, which is today one of the super tribes or super iwi, billion-dollar industry in Aotearoa, New Zealand tribe, I should say. And I love when we tell these stories, their eyes start to light up and their back arch up, their chins face the sky, because they start to embody these characteristics of these ancestors. Once they realize that they too come from these bloodlines and that they descend from great ancestors like those in the stories that we share. And I always say that we're so lucky that we only have to reach back in our ancestral stories and bring those forward and bring them forward to solve the issues that we face today. And if all of our young people could do that, in my context, I believe that most of our young people can be well. And our communities will be thriving. Our rates of language speakers would climb, crime would go down, poverty would go down, we would eat better because we would understand that we have these connections to our food, and that actually our people traditionally were predominantly reliant on plant-based food, not meat like we consume today, which lead to a lot of health issues that we experience in my community. And so those are one of the ways that we connect with our young people and get them back to the land. I say, come back to your mountain and let the wind of our ancestor Tawhiri Marya blow through your skin and your hair. Come up there and yell all those negative thoughts into the wind and let them pass through you. Come and bathe in the waters that your ancestors once bathed in. Come and be with the land. Come walk it. Come and hang out with your aunties and your uncles. Come and be with the elders. Go and seek out the elders. And I always say to those of us who have that great sense of place and belonging in our communities, to embrace those who may not and who are coming to seek those out. Because sometimes there can be tensions between those of us who have grown up in the village and know the language and know the knowledge systems and the ways of being and doing, and there's tensions between those who don't. And then we start to become patch protectors. And we're like, oh no, we're not willing to share that up. Kind of thing. So I remind my family we need to be open because we're stronger in numbers. And we need the numbers when we're trying to take down our government and all these, capitalist forces against us. But we know too that we need to heal our people. And so that's one of the ways that we're engaging our young people and in support of our pursuit of reclaiming our ways of being and doing and our systems and our languages and whatnot. And I think with some of the movements that we're seeing in Aotearoa in New Zealand at the moment, those struggles, and we come from this history of enduring injustices, and we might be young compared to other colonial settler states, and we were very fortunate, I guess, in that narrative to be one of the last nations to be colonized, so they had moved along somewhat in their human rights or ethics of colonization, and somehow we're seen as this beacon for other global Indigenous communities. But those struggles that we are experiencing in Aotearoa at the moment are seen as opportunities for us to come together and to remind ourselves that we can't be complacent. Like with some of the resource management laws that we're experiencing in Aotearoa at the moment will undo 30 years of work that our elders have done previously. And so when those RMA changes happen, we're going to have to catch up another 30 years to get to where we are today. Some of the treaty issues that you may have seen in the news in Aotearoa, our racist government and whatnot are seeing us go back another 10 steps. But in those struggles, we're coming together, we're reminding ourselves not to be complacent, and that we have this collective power to resist those forces that are against us. So to your question about struggle, yes, it sucks, and it sucks that we've inherited this. I think of Aotearoa 175 years where we have experience with our settler government, and we've got this history of enduring injustice, but reminding ourselves of that and the struggles that we face today give us the resilience and the strength to continue to resist those negative things that are happening towards us today. So I'd say yes, it sucks, but yes, it's positive. Putting the silver lining on it, it's positive in the sense that it can bring us back together, and we can, in these movements, like the Tiriti movement that we're experiencing in Aotearoa at the moment, we're able to come together in force. Like the government is seeing the most submissions ever in its history on some of the matters that we are facing in Aotearoa at the moment. And I guess too, with the treaty in mind and the intentions that our ancestors had in entering some of those treaties was to work with our non-Māori or non-Indigenous partners. And then how do we embody that today? How do we work in treaty, in relationship and the context of the treaty with our partners? How can we transform their thinking and bring them on board our mission, not their mission that they came with, because we've moved along with the times now. How can we enroll them in our cause? And I guess going back to our values, our Indigenous values around manaakitanga, which is around caring for people, I think it's important for us, when you talked about the word Indigenous being weaponized, I ask whose narrative is that? Who is leading or driving that narrative? Because in my community, we view everybody should have a sense of place and belonging, but it's whose ways of being and doing and histories and stories are being prioritized. And for us, it should be those who are of the land, those Indigenous communities that should be prioritized because they were there first. They are the stewards of the land. They are the people who hold the traditions and the stories and have maintained that land for generations before those who came after us and who largely desecrated the lands, whose ways aren't working positively for the land, shouldn't be prioritized. And I'll just finish on one of the last things that in my own personal mission, to reconnect our young people with the land. Every time one of my cousins or my relations fall pregnant, because when I fell pregnant in the height of our land campaign, and I knew in that moment that I was going to give birth on the land, because those were one of the practices that were lost through colonization. And I told my family, I said, I'm pregnant and I'm going to have my baby on the land. And they were like, you can't, you need to be at a hospital where it's safe, where it's clean, where there's professionals. I said, oh my gosh, my family is so colonized. I had to remind them that generations before me, our mothers, our grandmothers were giving birth on that land. And part of us wanting to reclaim and protect the land was to bring back some of those practices. So I gave birth on the land. I said to my family, with or without you, I'm going to do this. And I did. I planned to have it under a pohutukawa tree on the land. But it was a Sunday, and usually that's prayer time, and I looked over to my left, and there were 40 people standing over there, so I was like, oh, I better not. So I quickly went inside the house on the 38-hectare block, and I gave birth to my daughter. And now my cousins, I'm like, Cuzzy, you're having a baby. Come to the land. Come and have your baby. And if they're not willing to have their baby for whatever reason, for medical reasons, or, for their preferences, or they're still on their journey, I say, at least please consider bringing your placentas back to the land. Because why I chose to have my daughter on the land, because I wanted I wanted to solidify her connection to the land. So even if she didn't have a connection to her land, because her father's also Samoan, and if by chance we had to move to Samoa, she could at least say she was born on the land, and that would bind her to the land. We planted a tree over her placenta, and she visits it every other day because we're still on the land. And I guess those two are ways that we can connect our family and our young people back to the land.
Thank you for that. What you were just sharing about knowing that colonization has caused the depression, the anxiety, the suicidality, the dependence on alcohol and drugs in our youth. That is what I studied with Raj Patel in our book Inflamed, where we looked at the rise of chronic inflammatory disease as the directly caused by the damage signals that have been created through colonialism, and specifically the structures of colonial capitalism. The inflammatory response in our bodies and our immune systems is an ancient conserved reaction to damage or the threat of damage. And so when your body can sense those damage signals, whether it's a paper cut, it mobilizes a whole host of cellular mediators to heal that wound. And then when that wound is healed, the inflammatory response goes quiet. But if the damage signals are coming every day from the water that's tainted, from the land you can't go onto because there's a housing development that's been built, from a place you can't go pray to, from being in debt as an independent driver of inflammation, all of these cumulative signals set off the immune system's response. And when those damage signals keeps coming, the immune system does not shut off, and we get a chronic smoldering inflammation. This to me was fascinating. Lyla June referred to it at the beginning of our discussion. I was fascinated to find studies that show that Indigenous communities that were connected to their language and their stories, so that had a sense of cultural continuance, of knowing who they are, were protected from developing type 2 diabetes and protected from youth suicide. And that to me, as a physician who's works in the hospital in the ICU, that was remarkable. That chronic inflammatory disease there's a protective effect of stories that tell us who we are and why we're here. And so those stories come through our lineages. And it cannot be overstated how important those stories are, because they come from a place and they come from a people, and they were meant for you, and they were meant for your relatives. And but the way that those stories have been forcibly extinguished, like the wells that were buried or cemented over because that water whispered too much into the ears of the people who remembered how to hear that water. And that went directly in the face of those forces that were making private property over what belonged to everybody and nobody. Our commons, our earth, the land, the water, the food. And so when these things are made scarce, which Mama Earth has given to us in abundance, in order to control our movement and control ourselves, it requires struggle. It requires principled struggle. And it requires, the word Lyla June said, it requires unity across our fields. So it's a great honor for me to be in community with some incredible Irish people now, including Ollie, my friend Ollie Moore from Talabio. We'll be speaking on Friday together. It's an honor to be in community with you. And I just wanted to know if we can open up some questions to the audience. Do you all feel ready for that? Any questions?
Well, first, thank you all so much for this really powerful panel. I'd love to know how you all relate with the emotions of anger and rage, and especially when we think about the colonizer. What are some leverage points, and do you believe that even when we think about the word violence, and not necessarily thinking about, physical violence and bodily violence, but infrastructure violence, like what is the spectrum? And then going back to the emotions of anger and rage.
So you're asking, how do we manage our rage, and where do we want to inflict our rage? I just want to clarify the question.
I guess, how do you relate with rage? Because rage is a natural emotion. And it's how do you respond to the rage that you feel within yourself? How do you transform that rage? And if you think about, the next 7 generations, what is the most productive way to respond to the rage you're feeling inside yourself?
So personally, I'm advocating for a global general strike. I just need to say that. I think we need to shut it all down. I think we need to stop participating in economies of violence. And this capitalist system is so violent that every time we do work that engages it, or don't create alternate economies of food and care, every minute that we spend giving to it, we're condoning the colonization of Venezuela, the colonization of what's Colombia next, Greenland, like what's going to happen next, right? And so my rage goes into organizing. I scream. I ask the ocean to take my rage when I need to, but I'm curious, Lyla June, and I'm curious to hear from you. How do you manage? Maybe we'll start with you, Andrea.
I don't know if I manage that well. Sometimes I scream a lot. But I would say similar to you. Like first from my background, which is studied psychology, I know that whatever I feel needs to be felt. And coming also from, being raised in a way where all my memories of pain and everything that should have made me angry was tried to gaslight it by my own family. First thing I learned is to feel it, to remember and feel it and be so angry that I can feel that underneath that anger there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of feeling of like impotence. And after feeling is working to change, but also from a space of compassion, because it's something I learned, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to marry a German, and even though we're divorcing now.
You have the opportunity to marry and divorce a German.
And divorce a German. And understand that a lot of the pains that I thought were only for my ethnic background, also he had lived. As a German that his family had to go to Switzerland and escape the Nazi regime. So the discrimination, the displacement, and learning how that gave me the opportunity to not do what many of my also indigenous descendant activists, very angry friends do back in Peru, which is blame it all in the white people. And I learned that to see from compassion that anybody that causes harm is because also that's the way they know how to relate. Because it's been taught, it's been like institutionalized. And as much as angry I want to be with it, just blame the systems and the others, if all I can do is to try to change it. And I realized that the best way to change it and to actually have a better solution for my anger was to approach the spaces that create these problems, like starting dialogue with corporations, with spaces that normally before this process I would have never set a foot into, like spaces like Davos, like spaces that in my community are satanized. And we say like, no, that is where the money, the corporate leaders are the ones that are destroying and polluting. We do not go there. And after basically tripping in my anger and pain, and I had the guidance of like, I need to, in a diplomatic way, in the best way that I can, engage with those environments and create dialogue and transmute my anger, compost it, like the land teaches us, to just throw it. This is also like an indigenous practice. We have rituals where we drink fermented drinks, and people get so wasted in that, and you cry and throw all your anger and your pain, walking in circles, in sorrow, giving it to the land, because she will know what to do with it. And she will help you compost it and feed the new life, which means the creative power, the creative capacity to come up with solutions and ideas, because that's creation, into, okay, what do I do now? So that's how that's what I do with my anger.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Like anger and rage can be alchemized into creative action. And one of the things I love doing is liberating food for community members. And I know Lyla, June, you're going to be teaching some of that this year. Can you talk a little bit about how you compost metabolize your rage?
Well, I think first, and this relates to how do you reconnect, how do you belong, I think it's really important to not blame ourselves for our rage or problematize ourselves for our rage, because frankly, the human body was not designed to sustain what we've sustained. It was never Creator's intention, from how I have been taught, for our bodies to endure war. We're not made for it, actually. Contrary to popular belief, we are not warlike. We actually cannot coexist with it. We're not built to sustain relocation and discrimination, medication of our truth, and the subjugation of our truth. And so to give ourselves a little bit of grace, first of all, and not feel shame for having rage, because it is the natural upwelling of our truth, for having witnessed what we've witnessed and experienced what we've experienced. So for example, here, not too far from where we're sitting, in the year 1603, Queen Elizabeth I made a decree that every Celtic harpist should be hung. And just a couple hundred years before that, her predecessor, King Edward I, massacred quite a few. Speaking of rage, and why? Why the harpists? You know, it's everything you just said. When we're connected to who we are and why we're here, which is what the songs of the harp were teaching, and not just the harpists, by the way, but the bards as well, were also to be hung. And my ancestors in Scotland, when they would go into our communities, the English forces, they would kill the bards first, and they would bury them face down so their stories would die with them. And so this is not stuff we were made to be able to sustain. And grief and rage are connected. And so I think it's very brave of you to feel. And the Western medical world wants us to be numb, which is kind of easier in some ways, but also much harder. And if we have the courage to feel, and to not blame ourselves for feeling rage, and to not blame ourselves for being disconnected, you know? My Lakota elder always says, Lyla, have compassion for the people who came across the Atlantic Ocean and hurt us so badly, because they were coming off of 2,000 years of open warfare. A lot of hard stuff. Like you said, the trauma is so ingrained, it's the water that we swim in. But there is time to grieve and to hold each other in that grief. Because just as we were not made to sustain these things, we were not made to do it alone. And good thing we have each other. And in these 2,000 years, there's also the very calculated and systematic assault and disenfranchisement of the feminine through the burning of women as witches, which by the way means wise one, and all the medicine that she carried, all the stories, all the lore, all the, you know, so to have compassion for ourselves in this time, and to know that our disconnection is, and then Queen Elizabeth, what happened to her, you know? It's like, geez, who hurt you? Like, my God. For one thing, she was on opiates from a young age, as were most of the royal family. And so we have to consider all these webs and cycles of violence, and where did, you know, as my other Lakota elder says, hurt people, and colonized people, colonize people. So how do we untangle that with love and grace for ourselves? And for me, that also comes with the rage being actually kind of a good sign, because it means you're feeling truth. Now the trick is hopefully to not use that rage to hurt others. That's the trick. And I think it goes to what you're saying of metabolizing and channeling that rage. And ultimately, one of the challenging things, but very important things, is this crazy idea of forgiveness. Most people think it's psychotic, and I don't blame them. But it's a very powerful thing to stop those cycles of violence in its track and to compost rage into liberation. Forgiveness does not mean you stop fighting every single day of your life for what's right. It does not mean you sit close to the person who abused you, because it's probably not safe to. But it means that in your heart, you are deciding not to hold it against them spiritually. And you're fighting for the collective liberation of all, which I know is controversial and different schools of thought on that, but that's just what I've been taught. So, number one, don't blame yourself for having rage. Number two, see it as a good sign. Number three, hopefully don't turn it into something that hurts others. And number four, screaming at the ocean asking the ocean to help you process. And ultimately, whenever you genuinely get there, maybe it takes years. For me, it took me 10 years to forgive someone after really trying to try to get to that state of forgiveness, however long it takes, as a goal, but not a rush. That's what I would say.
I think that is a fabulous way to wrap up this conversation. Would you please give a round of applause to these amazing women?